thank you very much for the introduction, particularly thanks to the Amigos del Prado for the invitation, and even more thanks to them and to all of you for the significant contribution that was made by the Amigos for the purchase of this remarkable painting, the Madonna della Granada. I'm sorry I'm going to be speaking in English tonight, but we do have the labels in Castilian. This evening, we will look at a painting by Fra Angelico. The Duke who bought it, a crown prince who acquired 4 pictures by Angelico, a prince regent who gave his daughter 1, a sculptor who loved Angelico, a world-class tenor who bought 2 paintings by him, a dealer who sold at least 8, a provincial banker who thought an Angelico would give him prestige in Roman society, a royal couple who wanted to project an aura of middle-class respectability, who owned 2 pictures by him, as well as an early biographer of Canova, the official who oversaw the sculpting of Canova's Venere Italica, and above all, a dashing curator who requisitioned 2 pictures by Angelico for his museum and was trying to get a 3rd one before someone was routed at Waterloo. Except for Victoria and Albert, all of these figures lived at a period when neoclassicism was the artistic style that held sway, and they all somehow were involved in the revival of the art of the 15th century Dominican friar, born Guido di Pietro and posthumously known as Fra Angelico. This revival led to the Duke of Alba's purchase of his Madonna in Florence in 1817. Toward the end of this lecture, we shall try to discover why neoclassicism and Angelico were such a fine fit. We'll get back to that, but let's for a moment stop with that dashing curator, Dominique Vivant Denon, who was in charge of requisitioning art from the European and North African territories that Napoleon had conquered. The first wave from Italy came in 1797 after the signing of the Treaty of Tolentino. The conquered Italian cities were required to provide masterpieces which would be paraded through the streets of Paris before being installed in the Louvre, which in 1803 was renamed the Musée Napoléon. Here are the great Italian pictures installed for Napoleon's second marriage. In 1811, Denon was a little less debonair, but his energy had not waned. He made another short trip to Italy and realized that his museum was lacking a whole period of Italian art, that which he called the primitives, essentially painting of the 14th and 15th centuries. Taste was changing, first of all in Italy itself, and the art of the period before Raphael had become a focus of interest. In Florence, the Uffizi had been reconfigured under the director Tommaso Puccini, in an installation that emphasized not the princely nature of the Medici collections, but rather offered a sweeping historical survey of Italian art. Denon picked up on this, realizing that the suppression of the religious orders and subsequent closing of churches opened an unparalleled opportunity for acquiring paintings. In January 1812, on his return to Paris, he went about gathering works by the Italian masters that he had forgotten or ignored in 1797, and Angelico was the prize. Indeed, Denon bought 1 for his own collection, the Annunciation, now in Detroit, and got 2 for the Louvre, parts of the predella, the Perugia altarpiece, and the coronation of the Virgin from San Domenico in Fiesole. Not one to simply install his new acquisitions in the museum, Denon curated an exhibition that opened on 25 July 1814 in the Salon Carré. Note that on the title page of the exhibition's catalog, the institution is now called the Musée Royal. It is very possible that the young Duke of Alba, who soon after bought the Angelico, now here in the Prado, saw the exhibition as he was then living in Paris. The publication is one of the first examples of a modern catalog, in which there are good descriptions of the pictures that were displayed, as well as biographical and critical summaries of the artists on view. There was a section on Giotto. Notably, the artist's stigmatization of St. Francis had been brought from Pisa. In the catalog commentary, there is an interesting statement about Angelico. After a few words about the Trecento painter, Giotto, it is said that Masaccio, 100 years later, was Giotto's true heir. The catalog laments that the Musée does not own any paintings by Masaccio, but is rich in works by Angelico, who was his contemporary and imitator, émule in French. During the course of this lecture, we shall come back again to that statement. Was Angelico an imitator of Masaccio, or did the relationship between these two painters work the other way? I will argue that Angelico was often the leader, and I shall use the Alba Madonna as a primary piece of evidence in constructing my case. The element that we shall first look at is the most prominent feature of the painting, which also gives it its title, the pomegranate, the Granada, that the Virgin holds in her hand and the little Christ child picks at. This fruit will help us precisely date the picture and show that it is precedent to the work by Masaccio and Masolino, the Sant'Anna Materza, after which art historians usually place Angelico's Alba Madonna. It will take some hard looking at pomegranates in this painting, in nature and in other Quattrocento paintings and sculpture, to understand why that fruit is such a key to the meaning and dating of the picture. Ever since the Prado acquired the work, I have become obsessed with the fruit, its color, shape, and meaning, and why Angelico included it in this Madonna. The pomegranate itself has undergone a revival in recent times. In Florence today, juice bars offer glasses of the fresh squeezed fruit. In America, there's a very successful commercial pomegranate juice, POM, for which all sorts of benefits are claimed. The company advertised its commitment of $35 million to scientific research on the fruit and asked its consumers to raise a glass to life and to the pursuit of healthiness. Upscale grocers offer pomegranate seeds already harvested and ready to eat, services that 15th century Florentines would have very much appreciated. Pomegranate seeds were used as a decoration in various dishes in the Renaissance, and pomegranate wine, fermented pomegranate juice, that is now largely in our Armenian product, was much appreciated. The 1492 inventory of the estate of Lorenzo de' Medici, which included among its effects 8 paintings by Angelico, also listed just as many barrels of pomegranate wine. The pomegranate is a familiar tree in Tuscany, as well as throughout the Mediterranean, known in historical records from ancient times and called in Latin the Punica granatum, the Punic apple. It bears fruit in the autumn, right about now, or a little bit before now, and if you go to the supermarket today, you will undoubtedly find large ruby red pomegranates. The rind of our pomegranate, however, is not red, but a yellow tone. It is precisely this yellow pomegranate that I have been on the outlook for recently. I happened to spend the month of October of this year in China, and I was delighted to find that in the southern part of that vast country, pomegranates are yellow and very close to Angelico's pomegranate. In the north of China, they tend to be red. So here's the yellow pomegranate. I opened it up in my hotel room to show how close it was to Angelico's pomegranate. Up north, though, in China, they're red. These are still maturing. The pomegranate was a symbolic fruit in China that referenced happiness and good luck all of which could come with many male children. You can see the male children here are there in among the pomegranates of this textile from the 10th century. Some of the most beautiful Ming blue and white ceramics have pomegranates in their design, as this one from the reign of the Yongle Emperor, which ended in 1426, probably just a year or two after Angelico painted the Alba Madonna. You can see them in red in this Qing dynasty porcelain. Angelico, of course, didn't get his pomegranates in China, but probably off of a tree, rather like this one growing in the garden behind the Virgin's house in this painting of the Annunciation here at the Prado. So this is the pomegranate here. Where Adam and Eve, already dressed, seem to linger one last time before being kicked out of paradise. Note the yellow color of the pomegranates. In Florence this autumn, I went to a horticultural exhibition of heritage fruit and vegetables to see whether I could find similar pomegranates. And early last month, the farm woman who sells her products in Piazza Santo Spirito near my house was offering near perfect yellowish pomegranates. I mean, they have a red blush on them, but that we're getting a little bit closer to the one in the Angelico, from her own plot of land in Impruneta. I was getting nearer. The Quattrocento pomegranate seems to have survived the centuries. And then very recently, my friend Moreno came home with a load of pomegranates from the tree in the backyard of his mother's house in Bucine, in the Arno River Valley south of Florence. They are yellow with just a blush of red. This was just 10 days ago, and I had finally found Angelico's pomegranate. It was the end of the season, and they were bursting open naturally on the tree. I had Moreno go back the next week and photograph the tree itself for you. So you can, was a little sad by this point because not many of the pomegranates have already been harvested. Its fruit reminded me of the pomegranate in the beautiful Tondo by Botticelli, in which the red ruby fruit, in other words, the seeds, seemed to foresee the baby Jesus' future sacrifice on the cross. Around the same time, in a painting with a domestic setting made for Filippo Strozzi, the Filippino Lippi also included a pomegranate. You can see here on the table. In the Angelico, the baby picks at the fruit seed by seed. They are packed in neat rows. The child, I'm told, looks about 9 or 10 months old, and he has good hand dexterity to be able to pick those seeds. This would mean that the Angelico has shown him with fruit that has ripened at about the same time as his age, because the fruit ripens in October when Jesus would be 10 months old. Considering the specificity of the plants and the bird in the Annunciation altarpiece here in the Prado, this attention to realistic detail in the Alba Madonna should not surprise us, even if it might seem a little bit like Netherlandish painting around the same period. The pomegranate is open and the edges are tattered as if it had not been cut with a sharp knife. It seems to have been one of those that have burst open naturally. In his other hand, Jesus holds a piece of rind on which he has presumably eaten off some of the other seeds. Well, Fra Angelico might actually not have protested with the palm company's advertisement that the fruit could help in the pursuit of healthiness. For him, the first meaning of the pomegranate, however, in this painting would have been Marian, having to do with the Virgin Mary. As a Dominican observant friar, the artist may have been familiar with the 13th century Dominican theologian Albertus Magnus' writing in praise of the Virgin, in which she is called the fruit of the pomegranate and Christ its tree and flowers. Similarly, the female lover of the biblical Canticle of the Canticles, frequently allegorized as the Virgin Mary herself, had cheeks as a piece of pomegranate. In that same text, the Virgin was also compared to the enclosed garden, which was described as a paradise of pomegranates, just like the plot of unkept land that Angelico painted behind Mary's house in the Prado's Annunciation altarpiece. In one other painting contemporary to the Prado Madonna, the Virgin and Child, now in the Alana collection in America, Angelico depicted Mary offering Jesus grapes, a patent reference to the Eucharistic wine, symbolizing the sacrificial blood of Christ. In the Old Testament, grapes and pomegranates, both harvests in the autumn, were jointly celebrated as the riches of the land of Canaan, in an episode that Christians interpreted as a prefiguration of the Eucharist. It's said that when spies sent by Moses got to the valley of Eshcol near Hebron, they, quote, cut off a branch with its cluster of grapes, which 2 men carried upon a lever. They took also of the pomegranates and of the figs of that place. In 1616, Poussin produced a masterful interpretation of the story, in which pomegranates are as prominent as the grapes. 2 men, one holding a branch with ripe pomegranates, balance a giant bunch of grapes on a pole. A woman on a ladder reaps pomegranates from a towering tree, and another bears a basket laden with them. In the Old Testament, the pomegranate actually also made up the principal motif of the woven design for the border of the vestments of the high priest Aaron, Moses' brother, and his sons, in which pomegranates and actual golden bells were to alternate. Glossing this passage describing the vestments of the priest, St. Jerome expounded on the pomegranate as a symbol of harmony, interpreting it in Christian terms as the unity of the church. The pomegranates and bells for Jerome represented the harmony of all elements, and when interwoven in a gold-threaded garment, it meant the providence of the divine sense that penetrates all things. In the 1420s, as in the seam of Aaron's tunic, the pomegranate came to dominate the decorative pattern of Florentine gold and silver threaded velvets, which were the pride of the local industry and retailed across Europe. Pomegranates growing out of a meandering branch were repeated along the length of a cloth in a pattern known in Italian as a griccia. Appropriately, a version of the same design is found in textiles from the Kingdom of Granada. The first instance of the pattern in a Florentine painting would appear to be the cloth of honor with metallic silver thread, suspended by angels in Masaccio and Masolino's Sant'Anna Materza. Now you can see these are pomegranates on a meandering branch. This painting was installed on the Bonamici family altar in Sant'Ambrogio in Florence, probably by 26 July 1425, the date of the feast of St. Anne, who was much venerated in the Bonamici family. Masolino in the painting painted St. Anne, Masaccio painted the Virgin and Child, and the two collaborated on the angels. The painting's cloth of honor is an advance in the intricacy of the pattern, as well as weaving technique from other earlier textiles with pomegranate motifs, which were more open and delicate, as can be seen here in the outfit sported by the man walking across the square in Masolino's nearly contemporaneous healing of the cripple and the raising of Tabitha in the Brancacci Chapel. Another advertisement for Florentine luxury textiles is found in Gentile da Fabriano's Adoration of the Magi, dated May 1423. The cloth in which the pomegranate fruit and branches are picked out in gold thread is worn by the middle magus. Gentili must have seen such a textile on display in the city itself. According to the tax records of 1427, the patron of the Sant'Anna Materza, Nofri Bonamici, owned looms for weaving figured textiles. He worked almost exclusively as a supplier for Felice Brancacci, a silk merchant. The close business relationship must have been the reason that Bonamici was able to hire Masaccio Mazzolino, who were then frescoing the Brancacci family chapel in the Church of the Carmine. Certainly, Nofri furnished the velvet for the same artist to paint in his altarpiece in Sant'Ambrogio, and is therefore probably the only producer from the 1420s that can now be related to a specific pattern. The pomegranate in the Prado painting has not been transformed into a golden and crimson piece of velvet, symbolizing St. Jerome's divine sense penetrating all things, but is nevertheless an emblematic fruit. In Italian Renaissance masterpieces, we are so used to seeing the Madonna holding a piece of fruit that there is a tendency to use it as a distinguishing feature of the title. For example, Giovanni Bellini and Dürer both painted pictures known as the Madonna of the Pear. Before Angelico, however, instances are very rare. In Trecento, Florence, a flower or the Christ child playing with a goldfinch, another symbol of the Passion because the bird lived in thorn bushes, are common features, but not fruit. Angelico, however, may have known of at least one representation with a pomegranate in a Dominican church in Perugia, Gentile da Fabriano's Virgin and Child of the early 1400s, in which the child clasps a whole pomegranate with broken skin, and the mother pinches its stem. Angelico's own much later altarpiece for the same church has the child displaying a pomegranate. Around the same time as the Gentile in Perugia, the Sienese sculptor Jacopo della Quercia carved the marble Virgin of the Pomegranate, commissioned in 1403 for the Cathedral of Ferrara. In Florence, probably by the time Angelico had painted the Prado Madonna, there was one near contemporary example of a virgin with a pomegranate. Donatello's Virgin and Child, now in the Museo di Stefano Bardini. Although it has gone for many years with the traditional title of the Virgin of the Apple, the fruit that she offers the Christ child is clearly a pomegranate. It serves as a trick to get the child to calm down and focus on something, as the Virgin does her best to restrain a superhuman child who has pulled her veil around himself. Here, the fruit is an allegory of Christ's passion and the naturalistic vigor of the child, a powerful reflection of his future sacrifice on the cross. In choosing the pomegranate as his symbolic fruit, Angelico was not following an ingrained tradition, but making a self-conscious choice. The emphasis is on the neatness of the seeds packed in rows, suggesting the meaning of unity associated with the pomegranate since the time of St. Jerome. For the artist's contemporaries, the pomegranate would have exemplified hopes and anxieties about the unity of Western European Christendom that arose in the aftermath of the papal schism that had racked European religious and political life since 1389. The pomegranates in Gentile and della Quercia pointedly highlighted the lack of church unity at the time of their creation. The schism had come to a crisis in 1404, around the same time as these works, after the death of Boniface IX, and the refusal of the rival pope, Benedict XIII, a hard-headed Spaniard, to resign. In the early 1420s, as a recently professed friar at San Domenico in Fiesole, Angelico would have been aware of the devastating effects that the next stages of the schism had had on that community of Dominican friars. The community had been founded in 1406 by the politically active Giovanni Domenici, whom Gregory XI elected late that same year, 1406, soon made his confessor. On 26 June 1409, when in Pisa a rival was made pope, the friars in Fiesole expressed continuing support for the patron of their founder. On the other hand, the Florentine government abandoned Gregory for the Pisan pope and that one's successor, Giovanni Cosa. The friars left Fiesole and spent the next decade in Foligno and Cortona. In other words, the convent of San Domenico in Fiesole was abandoned. Their numbers were decimated by disease as well as defection. The election at the Council of Constance on 11 November 1417 of Odone Colonia as Martin V gave the friars the opening to return to Fiesole, but they only then numbered 3. Leonardo Dati, Master General of the Order, headquartered at Santa Maria Novella in the town of Florence, skillfully saw to the rebuilding of the convent in Fiesole and the reception of the new friars, including now Angelico, a painter, and his brother Benedetto, a scribe. It is likely that they professed in the period in which the new pope's court sojourned in Florence from February 1419 to September 1420. Martin was housed in Santa Maria Novella, and the young painter, not yet then a friar, seems to have worked on preparations for hosting him there. This Donatello was actually part of the special decoration of his apartments that were prepared for Martin's arrival at the convent. In coming to Florence, Martin would have encountered the beautiful pomegranate cloths that were being made in the city that would have seemed to him celebrations of the union of the church. Soon, the textiles were featuring prominently in paintings themselves. How can we place the Alba Madonna in this situation? Does it too reference the newfound unity of the church? Let's try to more specifically date the painting by comparison to 2 other pictures, the Sant'Anna Materza by Masolino and Masaccio, and the San Pier Martire altarpiece by Angelico. Focus in the 3 paintings on the Virgin, the 3-dimensional sculptural quality of the body, the fall of the blue mantle around the legs, and the distant forward-looking expression of the face. If you look at those, you can see also that in one other painting, such qualities can be found, that is Angelico's Alana Madonna. Out of its frame, the Alba Madonna, when we take the Alba Madonna out of its frame, it becomes clearer that something is missing. The 2 angels at the side hold the cloth of honor behind the Virgin, but the panel is cut at the top, where a 3rd angel would have been needed to suspend the cloth. The best comparison for what that 3rd angel would have looked like is Angelico's Madonna of Humility in the Thyssen-Bornemiszen collection, and significantly, the Sant'Anna Materza. The compositional strategy is just the same. But, which of them came first? Florence of the 1420s was a laboratory in which ideas were being bounced from artist to artist. The assignment of an inventor's patent for an artistic idea to any single figure is near impossible. But in this case, we can garner enough evidence, albeit sometimes circumstantial, to show that Angelico's picture probably came first. The first key is information that places the commission of the San Pier Martire altarpiece early in his career. Once this early dating is established, the Virgin in it will then be the most obvious prototype for similar representations. The second element is the association of the pomegranate in Jesus' hand in our picture with another event in which the unity of the church was under attack, and that is the Church Council of Siena of 1423-1424. First, the San Pier Martire altarpiece. The only known document is a residual payment for it that was made in 1429 to Angelico's convent. Angelico and his friars must have waited a long time for that payment, however. A terminus post quem for the commission can be calculated from the date of the founding of the nunnery, and some of the first nuns who were commemorated by the presence of their named saints in the predella, now in the Courtauld Institute Gallery in London. So this is the predella with different saints. The nunnery, which belonged to the Dominican order, got its start in March 1417, when property was acquired near the Porta Romana in Florence. In a bull, a papal bull of 19 February 1420, Martin V specified that the building was ready and the nuns should be cloistered. A year later, in January 1421, several Florentine women became nuns. Two were from prominent families, Margherita degli Spini, who donated 2,000 scudi, and Maddalena di Bartolomeo Usimbardi. The predella to the altarpiece in the Courtauld depicts the Man of Sorrows surrounded unusually by Mary Magdalene on one side and John the Evangelist on the other. And then in the other section, originally it was just one long horizontal panel, you can see a Dominican nun with a halo, as well as Saint Cecilia, Catherine of Alexandria. So here's the nun, Saint Cecilia, Madeline, Man of Sorrows, John the Evangelist, Catherine of Alexandria, and Agnes. The nun on the far left has been usually identified as Catherine of Siena. But Catherine was not a nun, but a Dominican tertiary, which is another a part of the order, but not the same as being a nun. This figure is shown in the habit, however, of a nun. A Dominican tertiary's habit would have been slightly different. And we have other pictures by Angelico in which he shows the habit of the Dominican tertiary. So the identification of this figure as St. Catherine of Siena has to be incorrect. In fact, no female orders of the members of the order were then revered as saints, but there was a veneration for several figures considered blessed. And this one, I think, must be Margaret of Hungary. In fact, in honor of Margherita degli Spini and her generous gift of 1,200 scudi to the convent. In the central section, we find the Madeleine taking the traditional place of the Virgin Mary next to the Man of Sorrows. Well, this is probably in part a reference to the nun, Maddalena degli Usimbardi, who also became a member of the convent in 1421. The Madeleine also served as an example to all the women of the convent. Virgin, in fact, in the main panel, holds a round box in her hand, a reference to the perfumed salves with which the Madeleine washed Christ's feet. However, the presence of the two nuns named saints in the predella suggests that the commission of the altarpiece came after their entry in the convent in 1421. While the altarpiece might not have been executed immediately, there is no reason to think that given the concentrated efforts made to found the convent with 3 papal bulls and the importance of its supporters, such a commission was delayed very long. The Prado painting must date in the immediate aftermath. But the pomegranate, that symbol of church unity, might help us to more specifically place the painting not only after the end of the schism in 1417 at the Council of Constance, but at the time of the next church council in Siena. Questions of heresy, in particular, the denial of the transubstantiation of the Eucharist by the Wycliffes and the Hussites, were discussed at the Siena Council, as well as the continuing division of the Greek Orthodox and Roman churches, with the hope that the Eastern Church would become part of the universal church. Sassetta's Arte della Lana altarpiece, Sassetta's a Sienese artist, for a church of the Carmine in Siena, commissioned during the latter part of the meetings, addressed heretical beliefs about the Eucharist directly. One of the scenes here on the screen shows a friar who denied the doctrine being struck down at Mass. And another actually shows the burning of a heretic outside the walls of the city, a patent reminder that heretics were being burned. In 1415, John Huss had died at the stake at Constance, condemned, despite guarantee of safe passage, at the very council that later elected Martin V. Angelico is never so tropical in any of his paintings, but the pomegranate would have been easily understood by his contemporaries as a reference to pressing concerns for the unity of a church threatened by heresy and the continuing division with the East. The council would have been followed closely by the Dominican friars in Florence, as two of their number took leading roles at the event. Leonardo Dati, who we saw before, the Master General of the Dominicans, was one of the Pope's 4 representatives of the council, in fact, the head of the whole council. Dati was the one who had seen to the refounding of the San Domenico in Fiesole after the schism, and also to the hosting of the Pope at Santa Maria Novella. Dati's closest collaborator in both those enterprises was the Dominican friar Girolamo di Giovanni da Firenze, one of the few I don't have a portrait of. Dati invited him to pronounce the Epiphany sermon on 6 January 1424 in Siena Cathedral during the seating of the council. A fierce defender of papal rights, Dati probably engineered Girolamo's sermon in face of a vocal movement within the council calling for more frequent meetings, a patent effort to erode papal authority. Girolamo gave a forceful speech, an example of early Florentine humanism, with references to Virgil, Cicero, Petrarch, whom he called Florentinus poeta noster, and even Boccaccio. Such references must have impressed, but also shocked the prelates gathered from all over Europe, not used to secular writers being cited in learned Christian preaching. Even more disturbing than the sermon's stylistic flourishes was the content, which was immediately denounced for mistakes. Theologians from 5 nations were appointed to correct it. What particularly irritated them was Fra Girolamo's use of the scripture in Matthew beginning, "The scribes and Pharisees have sat on the chair of Moses." It was seen as a moral admonition to those agitating for the conciliar movement, which was challenging the papal authority in which the Florentine Dominicans saw the unity of the church. The tumult caused by the sermon was such that 3 months later, in March 1424, Dati and the other papal representatives left Siena in secret. Once they were safely in Florentine territory, they declared the council closed. It is not known who commissioned the Prato Madonna. The original frame, which may have had a coat of arms identifying the owner, is lost. If the pomegranate, however, can be understood as a topical reference to the promotion of church unity as articulated by the Florentine Dominican friars in Siena, might the painting have been made for Leonardo Dati, who oversaw the events at the council. The probable time frame for the picture is after the San Pier Martire altarpiece, commissioned, as I explained before, sometime after January 1421. To the period just after the end of the council in March 1424. While this is a wide range, the probable date is nevertheless before any work could have been begun on Masaccio and Masolino's Sant'Anna Materza. Being a collaborative work, that painting, the Sant'Anna Materza, this one here, and here, came during Masaccio and Masolino's partnership for the frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel. Masolino began the project of the frescoes after November 1424. By November 1425, he had, however, signed a 3-year contract to go to Hungary, putting an end to the two artists' Florentine collaboration. Given the Bonamici family's concerns to have their altar adorned for the Feast of St. Anne, for which they paid for special annual summertime celebrations, including a performance of a boys' choir, the painting was probably made to be installed by the feast day, 26 July, in 1425. The Masaccios Christ child in the Sant'Anna Materza has a vigor that has been widely admired. The baby looks like a little athlete, a sculpture perhaps by Donatello, but it is also silhouetted like a cutout and not fully integrated into the composition, hardly evincing the refinement with which Angelico was able to blend at that point his figures into unified pictorial relationships. Even later, Masaccio elaborated on an idea taken from Angelico's Madonna in the Alana collection, in which the Christ child reaches for a bunch of grapes held by the Madonna. In the Virgin and Child from Masaccio's Pisa altarpiece, this one here, on which he was at work from November 1426, he depicted the baby munching on the grapes and sort of literally squeezing the juice out of them in an obvious reference to the wine of the Eucharist. If, as is likely, Masaccio knew Angelico's previous representation, it would have mean that he visited the friar's workshop as the Alana Madonna was a devotional panel for a domestic setting, probably a bedchamber. Once it left Angelico's hands, it would not have been easily available for outside examination. We do not know what happened to Angelico's Madonna between 1424 and 1817, when the Duke of Alba found it in Florence, except that someone cut off the top angel. Alba may not have even realized this, as when he probably bought it, it was in a neoclassical frame. The present frame is neo-Gothic from the 20th century, I believe. But there is a photograph of an earlier frame, although even that might not have been the one from 1817. If the Duke had a copy of the Catalogue of the Primitives from the Paris exhibition of 1814, I hope that he did not mind owning an Angelico over a Masaccio. He might not have been aware of the relationship of the two artists, although he seems to have frequented, from his own diary we know this, the Accademia di Belle Arti in Florence, where, since 1810, the Sant'Anna Materza was hanging. Alba would have known that his acquisition was part of a growing tide in favor of the primitive Italian painters, and in particular Angelico, much of it beginning with Dominique Vivant Denon's visit in Florence in 1811, which can be followed in part through his correspondence, including to that of his former paramour, the Greek-Venetian Isabella Teotocchi Marina Abrizi, who was Canova's first biographer. Denon did not get to see her on his 1811 business trip to Italy, but once on Italian soil, his thoughts seemed to have turned to her. What I would like to emphasize, though, is not so much the relationship between the two, or between Isabella and Canova, but rather how extraordinary it was that a group of thinkers, collectors, and artists devoted to the principles of neoclassicism and the universality of its language came to find the Dominican friar Angelico an idol and an object of fervent collecting. The head of the Accademia in Florence in 1811 was Giovanni degli Alexandri. It was he to whom Denon turned for arranging the shipping of the coronation of the Virgin to Paris. Alexandri was a good friend of the sculptor Canova and was overseeing the production of Canova's Venere Italica for the Uffizi, which was meant to replace the ancient sculpture known as the Medici Venus, which Denon had sent to Paris in the first round of requisitions for the Louvre, 1797. For himself, Denon, as I mentioned before, got the panels of the Annunciation now in Detroit. There's also the Virgin, but I'm only showing you the angel, and is said to have been trying to buy the Assumption of the Virgin now in Boston. That painting was exhibited in London in 1816 after its owner, Reverend John Sanford, resident in Florence, had returned to his native country. He claimed in the catalog that Denon thought it was the best of Angelicos, but he, Denon, could not buy it because of the downfall of Napoleon. Certainly Denon had started a trend. Within the next 5 years, several paintings by Angelico came on the market and entered important collections. And let's look at them. In 1813, the German Florentine dealer Johannes Metzger, via George van Dillis, sold Angelico's Entombment of Christ from the high altarpiece of San Marco to Crown Prince Ludwig of Bavaria. In 1816, Regent Prince of Wales, the Regent Prince of Wales, George, gave the Thyssen-Bornemiszen Virgin of Humility to his daughter Charlotte on her marriage to Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, later King of the Belgians. And in 1817, in Florence, the tenor Nicola Tacchinardi, a favorite of Rossini, was able to obtain the martyrdom of Saints Cosmas and Damian from the San Marco altarpiece from the Accademia in Florence, thanks to its director, the neoclassical painter Pietro Benvenuti. Tacchinardi had trained as a sculptor, even though he was a singer, and also as a painter before becoming a musician, and was later a good friend of Canova, in whose studio he worked even after becoming one of Europe's most famous singers. Perhaps it is via Canova that the singer became interested in Angelico. Tacchinardi had a large collection of paintings that he had bought in Paris during his years on the stage there, publishing a catalog in 1813 before returning to Florence. Tacchinardi is also recorded, Elba may have heard him sing at the Pergola, and Elba would have certainly heard of him because he was like Pavarotti, let's say. Tacchinardi is also recorded as having bought the predella to the San Domenico altarpiece, which was later sold to Metzger to Vincenzo Valentini, a Roman banker. Pietro Benvenuti, who helped Tacchinardi get the Angelico now in the Louvre, was also much admired by the Duke of Alba when he was in Florence. In fact, Benvenuti, I understand from the Duke's diary, was one of those who actually took the Duke to see things in Florence. And so I'm showing you an example of some of Benvenuti's paintings here. And it is probably the axis of the dealer Metzger, degli Alexandri, the head of the Accademia, and the painter Benvenuti that Elba found his painting in Florence in 1817. Carlos Miguel Fitzjames Stuart y Silva, the 14th Duke of Alba, was then 23 years old. With his new Sicilian wife, his mother, and his half-sister, and a suite that included the French art advisor Benoit Guillaume Publot, lived at the Palazzo Corsi on the present-day Via dei Tornabuoni. The Duke did not like the city of Florence, writing his diary, Florencia me disgustò cal siempre. Nevertheless, he had important family relation in the city. His great-aunt, Caroline, Countess of Albany, the widow of the last claimant to the Stuart throne of Great Britain. The Duke himself was descended in the illegitimate line from King James II of Scotland and England. Caroline's lover, the woman you see here, was the painter then, François-Xavier Fabre, who had started the portrait of Elba. This portrait, So this is Fabre's portrait, which he just began. And he was, Fabre, the artist, was the lover of the Duke's aunt, Caroline. Alba also had portraits of himself and entourage sculpted by Lorenzo Bartolini. The Fabre portrait was left unfinished because the Duke departed for Rome, and this is also the portrait of Bartolini by Benoit of Poublon by Bartolini, who was the Duke's advisor. So the Fabre portrait, though, was unfinished because the Duke departed to Rome in 1818 after the death of his mother in April. Over the years, he had been in and out of Rome, where he had often encountered the exiled Manuel Godoy, another collector, and the exiled King Carlos IV and Queen Maria Luisa, who were then living in Palazzo Barberini. And these are their portraits by José de Madrazo, who also became a friend of the Duke of Alba in Rome. Though they became friends, the Duke didn't commission things from him, thinking he was a mediocre painter. Most importantly, however, in Rome was the French painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who had made a drawing of Poublot as well as another drawing of Alba's mother and sister. Here's the one of Alba's mother and half-sister, actually. From him, the Duke commissioned several historical works about the Alba family. Ingres also gave Alba's half-sister a drawing of St. Helen in a deliberately early Christian style. Ingres was later also a collector of long-ignored primitive Italian paintings. In Rome, 2 decades later, in 1839-40, he purchased a small painting by Masolino, although thinking it was of the École Florentine dans le goût de Giotto. In Rome, the Duke lived in the Palazzo Braschi, not that far from the Pantheon, where since the early 1800s, a series of commemorative busts provided a quick guide to Italy's great artists. In 1814, in fact, Canova had personally paid the sculptor Leonardo Bilioschi to do a bust of Fra Angelico for the Pantheon, as well as other busts of Brunelleschi and Donatello. In that same year, busts of Masaccio and Ghiberti by Carlo Finelli, another Canova associate, were also placed there. So when you went to the Pantheon, you saw a bust of all these Quattrocento sculptures, which were then making them, giving them great publicity and making them up-to-date painters in one way or the other. In 1818 and 19, the Duke of Alba's curiosity about the arts would have made him alert to new happenings, and perhaps of the German Nazarenes in Rome, who, although they did not directly copy Angelico, were much engaged with 15th century Italian art, as could be seen in projects at the Casa Bertoldi and the Casino Massimo in Rome. The Quattrocento was back, and it was now living on its own terms. Just a few years before, in 1795, the curator of the Uffizi, Luigi Lanzi, in his classic Storia Pittorica dell'Italia, had defined Fra Angelico as the Guido Reni of his time. No longer was that comparison with a much beloved Baroque painter needed. If anything, Alba's purchase of Angelico's Madonna was a sign of the Duke's modern horizons. The 14th Duke also owned another early work of Fra Angelico, the Funeral of St. Anthony Abbot, now donated to the Prado by the present 19th Duke of Alba. The 14th Duke probably did not know that, however, that Spain already had a long history with Angelico. The Prado's Annunciation from San Domenico in Fiesole came to Spain in 1611. On February 28th of that year, Mario Farnese bought it for 1,500 ducats as a gift for the Duke of Lerma, Philip III's favorite, who donated it to the Dominican Church of San Pablo in Valladolid. It was later brought to the nunnery of the Descalzas Reales in Madrid, and came from there to the Prado in 1861. San Pablo in Valladolid was the church of Juan de Torquemada, who had also been a patron of Fra Angelico in Rome and had been portrayed by him at the foot of the cross in a panel now in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is Torquemada, and this is his church. A much later Spanish collector of Fra Angelico was Francisco de Assis Gali y Fabra, who in 1927 bought a drawing of Christ deposed from the cross, now in the Fitzwilliam Museum. Gali y Fabra was later Director General de Bellas Artes de la República during the Civil War. The 14th Duke lived between two different artistic ages, Neoclassicism and Romanticism, that each interpreted Angelico differently. But let's look at the first, Neoclassicism, which the great art historian Hugh Honor said sought to produce an art of eternal and universal relevance. What in Angelico attracted the neoclassical painters and sculptors? If we look at the narrative scene by Angelico, another one that we haven't seen so far, we see that he has created a composition out of carefully posed figures. For this, I believe that Angelico relied on his own study of ancient Roman art, as can be seen in the comparison between this sarcophagus relief and the painting. The sarcophagus is in Cortona, the city where Angelico spent his novitiate to become a friar, and Donatello is said to have told Brunelleschi about the sarcophagus. This relationship with a language that comes from antiquity, but which could be interpreted in a modern way well characterizes the art of Angelico as well as Canova or David. While in the later 19th century, Fra Angelico would become a sign of religious propriety and bourgeois respectability, even when collected by royals like Victoria and Albert, I think that when the 14th Duke got him, he was considered a painter's painter, an artist's artist. And painters, even later, understood this. Angelico's transformative role can be seen in that both Degas and Manet came to Florence and made copies after his frescoes in San Marco. Manet came back, here are Manet's copies. Manet came back to Angelico in Paris in the 1860s, so a decade later after his trip to Florence, turning one of his earlier copies of the painter, fresco, into a print, which was produced at the very same time that Manet was struggling with paintings that would transform his own style and painting altogether, the Olympia and the Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Degas also did copies at the same time of Angelico at the same time he was working on one of his early revolutionary paintings in Florence. Here's one of his copies, drawing in San Marco. We even have a slip giving him permission to do drawings there. At the same time, he was painting this painting of the Bellelli family. Later, the dealer, René Gimpel, recounted that if Degas had come to buy his gallery to see a painting that by Angelico that he, the dealer, once had on sale, Degas would have said that it was so delicious that it would have been something to sleep with, c'est de coucher avec. That's a painting that he had hoped to show Degas. Degas' niece later claimed also that the painter copied Angelico with l'amour et piété, love and piety. And that devotion was not necessarily a religious one, but one that of a community of artists across the ages. And I'd like to end there, thinking that perhaps in the exhibition that's here at the Prado, the Meta Pintura, this painting too could have fitted in very well. Thank you very much.